legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Stephen Murphy, who joins us to discuss the film 32 Counties, A Quest for Hope in a Time of Darkness. In the winter of 2021, three artists, Aidan Killian, comedian, Tiernan O'Rourke, musician, and Stephen Murphy, poet, came together as brothers and set out on a quest to call in the intentions of love, healing, and freedom to the land of Éire. Over the course of 32 days, they planted 32 flags on 32 mountains in the 32 counties of the sacred island of Ireland. The flag they chose was not the tricolour of contemporary usage, but the ancient flag of the Irish Citizens' Army, immortalised as the flag referred to in the opening words of the 1916 Proclamation. In the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. Aidan, Tiernan, Stephen, this is their story. Love, not fear. Healing, not sickness. Truth, not lies. Freedom, not enslavement. Hello and welcome, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Howdy, Greg. How are you getting on?
It's a pleasure to talk to you today. I've just come off watching a film that you and some friends, colleagues put together called 32 Counties. That's kind of informally subtitled A Quest for Hope in a Time of Darkness. We're going to be talking about everything that led up to the film, the process of making it, the response to that, so many things about the recent times we've been living through, and I think more importantly, the future, what we can learn from the past going forward. Before we get started, just tell listeners a little bit about, there's you and two others, there's Aidan and Tiernan, who are the main figures behind this. Just give us a little bit of information about yourselves and then how this project came into being.
Yeah, no bother. Well, I'm a poet by trade, which is a random enough thing to say, but I've been at it most of my adult life. And we started this in 2021, and Aidan Killian is a comedian, and Tiernan O'Rourke is a phenomenal piano player, incredible musician. So myself and the boys, I called round to Tiernan's house just one afternoon for tea, and Aidan was landed on, and whatever it was, we're kind of going, look, we have to do something. What are we going to do? Because at the time, we weren't allowed to gig, we weren't allowed to work, because we were being told that what we did wasn't essential enough for the world around us during the lockdowns back in the COVID years, back in the wilderness years. And so we're sitting around just drinking tea, and we got this idea from somewhere. Tiernan had climbed a mountain before, and we were going up with another friend of ours, the woodcarver Sam Brett. We were going up a mountain the next day with him, and we got this idea to climb 32 mountains in 32 days, to give ourselves hope, but also to kind of bring back a sense of hope to the wider island of Ireland around us. And that's pretty much where it arrived from. And within an hour, we had the list of the mountains drawn out, the whole lot, and a kind of half a plan in place just to give ourselves something to do at a time where we were just going, well, what do we do with ourselves? Having dedicated our lives to artistic pursuits, and before the lockdowns, before the COVID years, we were making a living from our craft, and then we were just told that we weren't allowed to do what we do anymore.
So yeah, what an amazing sort of inspiring project to take on at any time, never mind during, the pandemic period. And even if you'd never filmed or documented any of it, just as a thing to do as a human being, it was incredible. But it took on this whole other dimension, didn't it, of significance and symbolism, given what the background against which it happened. But, two things really. As you said, creativity took a tremendous hit then, not only with the sidelining and effective banning of so much of the arts and culture, just saying we don't need this right now, we have to focus on essentials only. But as much as some people talked about getting creative during COVID lockdowns, that might have been true for some people who maybe learned a musical instrument because they didn't have to go to work anymore, etc., etc. But for a lot of people, it was very dispiriting, and I think a lot of creative people really did suffer in that period. And the other dimension to it, of course, was just the pure physical expression of freedom in that, don't go anywhere that's not essential. I mean, in the UK, we suffered certainly travel restrictions that were punitive, but some of those that were in the Republic of Ireland, now obviously for your project, you traveled all over the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. But some of the restrictions in travel in the Republic of Ireland seemed extreme, like down to 2, 3, 4 miles from your base. So it represented so much in terms of creativity and the spirit of freedom. Just the act of getting in vehicles and going all around the country would have attracted the interest of the authorities, shall we say?
Yeah, it would have. At the time, the distance lockdowns, I don't think they were in place at the time, but still, the fact that they ever were is just madness. Really, telling somebody that you can't go more than 2 kilometers outside your comfort, outside your comfort zone, outside your home. It's well, I don't think there's any other term for it other than fascism to impose that level of restrictions on people is, insanity really. But, you mentioned earlier in terms of on creatives and stuff, like how hard the lockdowns were. And I remember like a very, very dear friend of mine was murdered by lockdown. And this man had been on the main stage at the main festival in Ireland. He'd toured the world. He'd been residency in New York. A dear friend of mine called Gar Kane. And the last time I saw him alive, we were gigging together and in front of a couple of thousand people in January 2020. And in October 2020, he was dead because he didn't have that creative outlet anymore. And he went down the COVID rabbit hole and he couldn't see the light from the darkness. And I remember going over, and this is pretty dark, sorry, but I remember going over, it was level 5 lockdown at the time, so nobody was allowed to go anywhere. And I'm just so proud of his wife for having the bravery to have a wake for him. And I couldn't tell my mother that I was going to, but I had to go and say goodbye to him. I had to go to his funeral, But my mother would have been terrified if I told her that I was travelling over to Dublin to go to my friend's funeral, which is, again, crazy, really. I remember picking up his young fella and saying, how old are you now? And he said, I'm 6. And it just broke my heart because he was the same age as my own young fella. And I'm going, he went so far down the rabbit hole in the COVID stuff that he left 3 young boys after him. And those young boys now that are growing up without their dad, because he was the one that was ringing me, telling me about, all the different kind of bits and pieces that we all know in terms of the lab in Wuhan, and, your one writing the article about it being in the wet market and all these things. But way back in March 2020, he was the one ringing me, telling me about them. When I had been in hospital with what I believe to have been COVID, I know quite a lot of deniers and stuff. I'm not one of them. I just think it was cooked up in a lab for a totalitarian agenda, but that's a different story altogether, But he went so far down the rabbit hole that it killed him. And to what end, To what end? As in, how much of the world can we take on that is safe for us? And I just kind of arrived at a place where we have to mind our own minds. And in terms of the mountain thing, Greg, going up those mountains was a way, and we mentioned in the documentary, it's a way to rise above, the madness of the times, to get away from all that, to get away from the noise, being blinded by information at every turn, being told, the militant divisions between people, the polarization, the fundamentalism that was so rife, whether pro or anti, whatever it happens to be. And it's still ongoing. All these divisions are just pumped at us all the time. And it's actually just creating such a chasm within society that I think, we actually need to kind of step back from maybe the machine and the binary nature. You're either this or you're that, and kind of step back and go, okay, well, where are we going here as a collective, as a species? Where are we going here? As far as I can see, with even half an eye open, it's not pretty, like.
No, you mentioned what happened to your friend and leaving behind those children, and for what? I mean, you talked about him taking the weight of the world on his shoulders in some ways, but in terms of those who would have, maybe not as his death, but who would have said, quite right, stay home, quite right, don't do this, quite right, don't do that, it's for the greater good, granny killer. And ultimately, looking back, what for? What are those children without a father for? Point to the gain, if you can, but you can't. You really can't. No. There's a scene in was talking about someone that I knew, not well, but worked with many people who worked with this guy. There's a scene, you may have seen the film of Escape from Alcatraz with Clint Eastwood.
I think many years ago. I can't actually remember it offhand.
Well, a lot of people listening might remember this scene, but there's this absolutely sadistic prison governor in that film, played by Patrick McGoohan, who just seems to be out to torment and punish. I mean, that's a maximum security prison. Okay, we get that. But he seems to be going above and beyond the call of duty to torment and persecute the prisoners, some of whom who found themselves there just as a result of, bad decisions. Okay, but they're not necessarily bad people. And there's one scene where there's a guy his art really is how he keeps himself sane in prison. He's in there for life, and he has oil paints and canvases and brushes. And these are privileges granted to some prisoners. Other prisoners do different things, in the workshop, and just access to books. It's not a death camp, so they have to have some human life, as it were, some semblance of life. But at one point, without justification, but just persecuting this guy, the prison governor has this guy's paints and canvases taken away from him. And he said, "This is all I've got. You can't take that away from me. I don't have anything else. That's all I'm alive for." And I remove them, and they're taken away. And so he finds himself in a woodworking shop. They create little items out of wood, ashtrays, who knows what the hell, to be sold on. Again, it's something for them to do. And this guy says, paint's taken away. He asks for. You have to request tools when you're in the workshop. You don't just get them. One of the prison guards will get whatever tools you need. So he asks for a hatchet to cut a piece of wood that he's working on. And he then gets the attention of the head prison guard who's in the workshop at the time. And he says his name. And so he gets his attention. And then he slowly raises the hatchet above the workshop table and brings it down on his hand that he paints with, and severs all of his fingers on that hand. And that's his comment on what has been done to him. I'll never paint again. And I mention all of this because there was someone that, again, I know this person I referred to, who prior to all of the COVID psychosis worked with his hands. He was a fine craftsman. I'm even like welling up even thinking about this, that he worked with his hands. He was only a young man, but he had a bright future. He had skills almost no one in the world has. And one of the things he could do was woodworking without anyone else knowing. He was found dead. He hanged himself because he just couldn't see a way out of this pit that he was in, unable to work, unable to express himself.
Yeah.
And it was discovered that bit by bit, in his apartment, using his woodworking skills, he constructed gallows.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So I just, sorry again, if it's dark and disturbing, but these are stories, I think, that didn't really get told about that whole time.
Yeah, well, exactly. Those are the numbers that aren't going to make the news, you know. And for me, like I have this piece that got a bit of traction online years ago, but it doesn't matter in terms of the numbers of online hits or whatever. It's nice that it connects with people, but it's a poem called "Before You Push the Chair" about the suicide epidemic, and I wrote that back in 2016, before the COVID years, before people were actually forced back into it, before they were forced to be in their own homes. And there was already an epidemic of suicide at that point where people, it's not, the problem wasn't mental health. The problem was societal illness. You know, we benchmark mental health on how well people adapt to a fundamentally sick society and then medicate them when they don't. And that's pretty much the societal approach to how we deal with where we're at in terms of our, you know, subjective realities within the mind. And a lot of people are struggling, and the amount of people that, particularly young men, that fall into despondency, or maybe because, you know, I'm a reasonably young man myself, they felt that they could reach out to me because they felt that I was speaking their truth. The amount of young men that reached out to me, like privately via my Facebook page, who just who didn't see anywhere else to go. And so many people were so lost. It's actually incredible, you know, and a lot of them, you know, who can't talk about it in a public sphere, and you know, they look at me and they go, oh, you know, well, that takes a great courage to be able to talk about, you know, struggling because the stigma is so real, you know. But I'm going, actually, no, it doesn't. Like, I don't see myself being in a place of vulnerability. Like, I'm not a victim. I'm actually quite strong because I'm able to look within myself and go, okay, actually, now I'm in a good space. But before I wasn't. The poem, like, it might be called "Before You Push the Chair," but it's not about depression. It's about addressing societal illness and saying, anybody with even one eye open, how would you not be depressed about the state of the world? And that was before COVID. And then COVID lands on, and it's just another whole level of, insanity.
Well, before we went on air, so to speak, you were commenting on 32 counties being uplifting, and it really is, and it's inspirational, I would say. So
yeah, Jesus, we went fairly dark in it there. Sorry.
Exactly. No. I'm kind of going to just say to listeners, stick with us, because this is ultimately a story. Oh, it's more than hope. It's actually the realization of that, you know, of the positivity, and what, you know, what we're capable of, how we can rise above all this, literally and figuratively. But a lot of people talked at the time about the lockdown, quote unquote, benefits, whether that was clearer running streams, returning wildlife, how people had time to think more about, you know, where they were going in life and priorities, and then people baking bread and, you know, learning to play the, you know, the lutes or whatever. Now,
learning new things. Yeah,
there is truth to that, but two things I would say. One, I hated the whole bloody thing from start to finish. I didn't talk about it very much. I just got on with it, you know, with my life. Doing what I was doing. I realized it was important to not let, you know, this, I was not going to allow them to steal my life. Okay. But I absolutely hated it. So for people, I'd hear them saying, oh, well, you know, it was wonderful. I wish we could go back to it in a way. And I would say, well, the suicide rates were off the charts. And they were like, oh, I know. But do you know what I mean? And I said, well, look, all of these supposed benefits of lockdown, they are available to us all the time. You know, if you want to spend time in nature, spend more time with your loved ones, learn the lute or the harp or any other bloody thing. You can
do that anytime you want.
Now, lockdown may have illustrated that to some people, brought that home, but a lot of that's been forgotten as well. So my response to the people who were saying, oh, blah, 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 you know, it was the positives. Okay, but at what cost? You know?
Yeah. And there's another piece I do called "Hold Tight," which was actually written back in October 2020 when McLean took his own life. And there's a line in that when you mention it, it's like going, and I get people saying stay safe and stay home, but what about people who aren't safe alone? And like you say, those, so like you were saying there, so those are the stories that don't really make the news. And it was beneficial for people because it did kind of bring people back to themselves and kind of get people, growing their gardens again. But as soon as the world opened up, they went back to that age of convenience. They went back to that, like I remember, I think the drive-through in McDonald's or something, there was fights outside it in Dublin because the drive-through McDonald's opened again after lockdown, and there was like 3 mile tailbacks down the road trying to get into McDonald's, which, you probably shouldn't go to when all is going well. Never mind, never mind any other time. But
maybe people should have used lockdown to learn how to hand make a really good burger, because it's not difficult,
No, it's not difficult. But I think it's kind of, people were just so thrilled by the novelty of being able to go to the drive-through again, being able to go for that, that dirty habit, that kind of, what's the term that I'm looking for? Is kind of the guilty pleasure. That's the one,
Yeah, of course, but they're on a deeper level. There is something about what people find meaning in, and for some people in sort of in a meaningless, or a world that they're told is meaningless, they find a sort of a pseudo meaning or a substitute for meaning in things like shopping and and eating out, and just that sort of.
Oh, absolutely. Like the idea of retail therapy, the idea of filling the void with nothing. We live in a kind of it goes back to the idea of Nietzsche and the God is dead thing, and we live in a kind of a godless world now, or we not necessarily. And this is kind of part of the documentary as well, was kind of reclaiming that, because it was a pilgrimage as much as anything. But certainly in terms of Ireland, we went from being a very Catholic place to then the reports of the abuse came out, and then an entire generation turned away from the church, whether rightly or wrongly. But we threw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of throwing God out with organized religion, and in that void, we replaced that. We replace that all the time these days with the deification of celebrities. And we build them up just to knock them down again. And it's kind of this kind of false icons and false gods. And even the idea of materialism is another form of false god that we just kind of try and fill the void of meaning with, even though it doesn't actually work.
Probably around the time that you were seeing the coverage of the queues for McDonald's drive-through, the local equivalent here was that the biggest IKEA superstore, for those listeners overseas who don't know what that is, IKEA is a Swedish furniture and kind of home items, make things pretty much for every home room in the house.
Flat pack furniture, basically.
Yeah, exactly. But they have a big superstore outside Leeds in West Yorkshire, just one of the big cities in the region here. And the news had aerial drone footage of the first day that IKEA Superstore opened. And the car park was completely full. There was a queue like several miles. And there was a physical queue to get into the building because, of course, they still had so-called social, or I prefer to say anti-social distancing within the store. So long story short, there was something like a 2-hour wait, 2 hours standing outside IKEA with your trolley, and before you could actually go in, and people were just gleefully doing that, and it was exactly like Dawn of the Dead, the George Romero zombie film. It was satirizing consumer culture and materialism, where all the undead zombies show up at the shopping mall and lay siege to it, and one of the remaining humans besieged inside is saying something like, "Oh, they come here. They don't really know why. It's just a memory of something significant from the past. They knew this place was important to them." It was like that.
Well, it's kind of I was saying this just the other day actually, but it's going in terms of the COVID idea. It's like, take away people's civil liberties and they'll be fine, but take away if you try to take away their iPhones, to be riots in the streets. So again, it's the kind of placation of people as well. And you mentioned like the IKEA or the McDonald's or the material culture, but it's just kind of this kind of age of distraction that we're living in. that we're looking, so long as we're distracted, it's the bread and circuses. Yeah, the same idea. It's like even when during the lockdown, when they brought back sport, for example, and you're going, all right, so art isn't essential, but sport is. So we're not allowed to perform and do our job, but it's okay for people to play football because that's an essential service. And it's essential because it provided a distraction for people, And it's the same thing when they kind of told us, it's going, oh, don't worry about it. We're all connected. It's fine. There's the irony somewhere that we're on a Zoom call at the minute, but, it's going, oh, we're all connected at a time when we've never been less connected. Like, to my mind, the great epidemic of our time, pandemic, whatever term you want to put on it, is loneliness. Is that we've never been less connected, and we're being sold this kind of Orwellian doublespeak of connectivity. And I get that the internet is a wonderful tool. I understand that it is when we hold it when we hold it right and when we use it right. But it can also, we've never, I don't know, there's just such a massive problem of loneliness, and not just old people, but people all across the spectrum that are suffering from this because we've never been kind of pushed further away from each other.
Yeah, and that, as you say, that was in train before COVID, but it's just continued ever since. It was exacerbated dramatically, of course, during that time. You mentioned Orwell and the doublespeak. I remember one particularly memorable image was of the Australian Premier doing a TV news conference, and behind him, one of many slogans, and politicians were all doing this. He had slogans everywhere, as they always do. But the Australian one was that staying apart keeps us together. And it was just, it was just like, yeah. I see how that works. Yeah, thank you for that.
And this idea of the build back better, where they're all kind of just using the exact same slogan, and you're going, lads, stop. Yeah, and it's anybody with an eye or two open can see it. But it's amazing how people, say, in their own homes, who are used to kind of listening to the same news for their whole lifetime, get into that habit and actually trust what's being said to them without actually questioning any of the narratives. And part of me is kind of envious of them to have that level of belief in one particular in one particular narrative. Does that make any sense? I don't know.
I know what you mean. And the Matrix is kind of a worn out cultural item to use for references now, but I can't help coming back to it sometimes. If we were all in the Matrix, I have to say I'd probably be one of the guys outside the Matrix in one of the pods eating that grey gruel and just going, well, this is a bit shit, but we're fighting for freedom. And maybe some of us would become like the guy, who betrays them and says, and he's talking to the Men in Black characters, and he's just saying, just plug me back into the Matrix and I'll sell out my bodies.
It actually reminds me of sorry, I'm a bit dosed here, but it reminds me of what a friend of mine said to me once. She said, sometimes the steak tastes nice. And it's your man, just quoting your man from the Matrix again, like you're going, where he's just there going, yeah, the steak tastes nice. So, you can understand it, but what I think is a better cultural reference than the Matrix these days. And I only watched it lately again for the first time in ages, and I just think it's an absolute masterpiece. Is the Truman Show. I think it's just utterly incredible with Jim Carrey in it. I don't know. I presume you've seen it, but I don't know the last time you've watched it.
Not for a while. Certainly not. I mean, probably not really since it came out, to be honest.
It's really, really worth sitting down with again and actually just watching. And you can thank me later, because it's just class. And I only watched it. I don't know why I got struck by this idea of watching it again, but I only watched it there a couple of weeks ago again, and I'm going, actually, that's brilliant, because that's pretty much exactly what we're living through, where entire lifetimes from people are putting the very first moments of their children on the internet, and everything is being documented and is being live streamed to this ever increasing kind of audience. And their child is growing up in public to an audience that they don't even know that they're being streamed to. And that's the premise of the Truman Show. But
Yeah,
at least that's what we're living through on a kind of on a social level. And people are kind of so concerned about their online reputations and their online this and their online that they're spending more time trying to pretend to be somebody online than they are actually being somebody offline. It's dark.
It really is. I mean, when I was growing up, my formative years, pre-teens and teens, long before the internet, the advent of the internet, the question was always like, or the doubt was always about, say, television. It was like, is this real? Can we really trust what's on television? But now it's almost like, well, if it doesn't happen on Facebook, if it doesn't happen on YouTube, then it didn't happen, which is really strange. It's a strange inversion of values.
It is. It's a total inversion of values. Like when I was growing up, if somebody started to follow you, you would be more inclined to call the guards than to follow them back. But now that's just like, there's your Twitter. It's like if you don't follow somebody back, it's kind of considered rude now, Whereas, and when at Facebook, if somebody was looking at what you were doing without kind of, without making their presence known, I thought that was always called voyeurism, no?
Yeah, well,
and now it's called social media. You're going, hang on a minute, there's something quite, yeah, like you say, the inversions that's there is, you kind of have to laugh at it in some mad way.
Well, let's now talk about the advent of the film project of 32 counties. You spoke earlier about this mad plan that you came up for of like erecting 32 flags in 32 of the highest points, hilltops, mountaintops in Ireland, in all the counties, as the name suggests. As I said, I watched the film just last night, and it was just ravishing. I loved the music and the message of it, and it made me want to go out and plant a flag myself, real or metaphorical.
Do it.
Yeah, exactly. And it was just really interesting to watch you guys and how you all how the thing unfolded as this idea on paper, between yourselves, and how the reality was, and how much more it seemed to be really than you could ever have imagined. So how did you get how long did it take to get the resources together? I know it was obviously didn't take too much on that front, but you still had to say, okay, we've all got to have the time to do this. We're going to do it in this order. I mean, logistics, just, how long it took you to get it all together.
Well, I think that the time, for example, wasn't an issue, because we weren't allowed work anyway in the jobs that we were doing, so, we pretty much planned it in mid-October, and then we said we would start on November the 1st. And we did the first kind of climb with Sam Brett, who's a woodcarver in Shanachie, a storyteller for your international audience. And we did that in Sligo with him, and we planted kind of the first flag there. But officially, the climb started then in November. And what we were doing is we were going up the mountains with 8-foot scaffolding poles, and then another 8 foot of rebar, the flexible, steel poles. And we were attaching one to the other, the male and the female, and then we were tying the flag to the end. But we were putting the scaffolding poles, the steel frame of the flag, into these points, into these high points, these energetic high points around the island of Ireland, as acupuncture points, as acupuncture needles in the land, because Ireland is known as Éire. The island is known as Éire, which is kind of goes back to a kind of matriarchal lineage where it would be known as the female form. But in shamanic circles, Ireland is also known as the sacred heart of the world. And the idea goes like I was having this chat many years ago with a friend of mine called Brendan Lynch. But the idea goes that if you can light up Ireland, that the world will follow. And what's been really interesting is that since the documentary came out on the 16th of June on Bloomsday, actually. The idea that we had, and if you watch the documentary, Aidan actually talks about it in it. He goes, I don't know if that thing works, the idea of planting these poles to attract lightning back to Earth, to light up the Earth again. But every day for a solid month since we launched the documentary, which we had been calling amongst ourselves The Final Mountain, every day for a month, bizarrely, there had been thunder and lightning on the island of Ireland since the documentary went up.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalisedfreedom.com.
legalisedfreedom.com